And tonight, before I pray, I want to read just a small paragraph from a reading by Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is somebody that lots of Christians read. He's a Danish theologian, philosopher who, my guess is probably not the happiest of guys. But he writes a lot about the struggle of faith. The whole idea in churchy talk of something called the leap of faith, like the leap into darkness, is really the only way you can really trust God. That's language that we get from Kierkegaard. He wrote lots of great stuff too, and this is something that I hadn't read before. But he's talking about the life of discipleship and the difference between an admirer and a follower. And he says this: what then is the difference between an admirer and a follower? A follower is or strives to be what he admires. An admirer, however, keeps himself personally detached. That person fails to see what is that what is admired involves a claim upon him, and thus fails to be or to strive to be what he admires. That's typical sort of philosophic, circular way of saying, I can admire something from a distance and that places no demands on my life. But to follow, and in this case, of course, to follow Jesus is to look at Jesus' life and strive to be like that. Strive to let our life be changed. And I think that's a pretty good reflection for us for the Lent season. That repentance and reflection to prepare for Easter is partly so that we can reset ourselves from admirers who keep Jesus at a distance and say, wow, what a great guy he was. Good thing I don't have to be like that. To a follower, somebody who is willing to take on the cost of what it means to follow. And so anyway, that's I was just reading that this evening and thought that was something worth talking about as we approach the scriptures for tonight. Let me offer a prayer for us. God, we thank you that you call us to be followers and not just admirers. And part of that process is growing in our understanding of the words you've given us to show yourself to us. And so I pray that you'd be with us tonight as we go through this exciting story tonight, and that you would be with us and teach us what that story has for us as followers of you. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So here we are again. We're back to looking at the Bible. We're doing this as a way of understanding how the Bible came to be, but also how the Bible speaks to us now. The stats are all the same as they were before. 66 books. You know all this now. 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. Although, the more you can rattle this off, the more likely you are to get a critical question right on Jeopardy, which is not a bad thing. I probably haven't talked as much. I kind of, in this intro part, reminded us about the language. The Old Testament is written, it comes from Hebrew culture, and the dominant expression of the Old Testament is in Hebrew, but the Greek expression of the Old Testament is very influential, so much so that it's really the Old Testament that the New Testament writers knew best. And so it's worth just remembering that there are all kinds of cultural outlooks that come to bear on the book that we get on Amazon or can pick up at Barnes and Noble, or have limitless copies at the church that we can pilfer. The key to understanding the Bible is reading it, or at least understanding that it has a historical context, that these writings were written at a particular time and place, and they meant something then that we do best to understand, so that we can understand what it says to us today. And then, we also we always want to remember that the Bible comes to us in different forms of literature. The problem, or the challenge in our Bibles, is that all the pages look the same, but it's different kinds of literature in there. And knowing which kind of literature you're reading is essential for understanding what it says to you and what you can lean on it to learn, and what you can't, what you shouldn't lean on it to learn. And so we're gonna kind of move quickly through the review. Last week we talked about the end of the monarchy in the in Israel. In the northern kingdom, that happens in the 8th century BC, when the Assyrians come in and basically wipe out the northern kingdom, which had been called Israel or Samaria. Sometimes it's easier to call it Samaria because that differentiates it from Judah. And then there's Judah in the south, and that was the southern kingdom was around. We talked last week about King Josiah, who came to the throne at 8 years old, and by the time he was a teenager, he knew something about the fact that the temple was important, but it's a sign of just how far away the people of God, the people of Judah in this case, had gotten away from their faith and from their true foundations, that he knew that he was supposed to maintain the temple, but didn't really know why. And it's in the restoration of the temple that somebody finds a copy of the Torah. And when they read the Torah, they're shocked at this document that was supposed to be the document that bound them together for all time. And in reading it, Josiah then wipes out all of the other shrines to idols, and then and renews the covenant with God that God had made with Israel, that if you follow me, I will bless you, and once I bless you, you'll be a blessing to all the nations. That covenant is renewed under Josiah, but it's also pretty short-lived. Things are good for a little while, but the last four kings, the four kings that come after Josiah, are just lousy kings. And even in the text, this is at the very end of 2nd Chronicles. Even in the text, it says the name of the king, and then the next line is always, this king did what was evil in God's eyes. And so things are not going well. And alongside these kings, you have the prophet Jeremiah telling them, return to God, return to faith, or God has to punish you. And they don't listen. And they put Jeremiah in the sewer, they beat him, they chased him out of town, and he still shared the message of God. So those last kings were lousy. When God had had enough, he allowed Judah to be conquered by the Babylonians, and the elites, everyone with money or education or power, all of those people were taken into exile, and the rest were left there, but with no leadership, no wealth, no capacity for creating wealth, and basically in an occupied country. So you have probably the majority of Jews left behind in Judah, but the upper echelon, the leadership and the educated people and the wealthy people, were taken into exile. And so that's where we pick up part of the story for tonight, because tonight we're going to meet a woman named Esther. And this part's fun because it's a little bit like going through the story of Ruth a few weeks ago. It's just one of these stories that's like a pause, a P-A-U-S-E, pause, in the narrative of the Bible. You have all these king after king after king after king, and then you get a snapshot of what life is like. And remember that the book of Ruth is meant to show how normal people lived covenant relationships with God and with each other. And Esther is an interesting story, and we'll talk about how it came about after I summarize the story. But Esther is a book that was meant to uh, it has a particular purpose that we'll talk about, but it's meant to talk about what life was like in exile. And you'll see that exile did not mean slavery. This was not the same as slavery in Egypt. The king of Babylon took the elites back, and basically they became parts of the society there. And so that's kind of the backdrop for the story that I want to tell. So I'm going to tell a story. We can't read all 10 chapters of Esther tonight, but I've written up a little, I've written up a little summary so that we can understand what this is. Esther is an interesting person, and the story is an interesting story. I'll tell you now, it's a work of historical fiction. Okay, there's no real, the backdrop of the story is historical. They name the king of Persia. Some of the people there, the tribes that are named, are real, and the danger to God's people, the danger to the Jews, is real. But this story, I think we'll see at the end, it was written for a particular purpose, and we'll talk about that. So the book of Esther is set during the Babylonian captivity, when the elites of Judah were forced to live in a land not their own. It was designed in part to encourage Jews who were in danger in exile. And so it starts with a story that I think now with modern ears is pretty disturbing. The king of Persia, who's Xerxes, he throws a wild banquet that lasts for 180 days. Now, folks, I've been to some parties before. And as the extrovert, I've closed a few parties before, but I've never been to a party that lasted for 6 months. I'm open to trying, but I have never been to a party that lasted that long, and it is filled with drinking. This is, in many ways, an ancient version of a high-level frat party. In this party, there's only men. It is the king and the princes and the nobles and the esteemed guests from other places, and they are feasting and drinking to their fill for 6 months. Now, I don't even want to think about the hangovers along the way and then the one big one at the end. But there's actually a point in the text that says that the king ordered all of his wine stewards to make sure that every single guest drank all that they wanted to. So this is a party that those of you who have party backgrounds, you know that this is exactly the kind of party that leads to some debauchery. Now, I don't know the things that happen sort of off camera in this story, but here's what happens that's important for us. At the same time, in another building in the royal city, the queen, Xerxes' wife Vashti, is throwing a party for the women. Now, presumably, this is a tamer party, but I don't want to be sexist in this. That could have been 6 months of drinking too. I don't know. But Queen Vashti is holding a separate banquet for the women. Xerxes, in his drunkenness, wants to parade his beautiful wife in front of all of his drunken male guests. Now, oddly enough, in the moral values of the story, it's Vashti that's in the wrong for refusing her husband. But I think, for a document that was probably written sometime in the 4th century BC, Vashti comes off as a modern, as a woman with agency, right? That's a catchy phrase, but I mean, a woman with her own enough sense of herself that she's not about to be paraded in front of a bunch of drunken men. She didn't care who told her to do it. So she says no. The king gets angry, sends his servant back again. She says no again. and he divorces her and banishes her on the spot. So then the king has another problem. He's got to get through however many days are left of this 180-day party. And at the end of it, he decides he's going to find himself a new queen. And so the call goes out. For those of you who've seen Princess Bride, it's a little bit like that they've gone out looking for the most beautiful maiden to come and marry the king and become his queen. And Xerxes is smitten with a young woman named Hadassah. And Hadassah's other name is Esther. And so he chooses her to become his queen, which is an odd choice. She's Jewish. She is among the exiled Jews in Babylon, and she has no parents. Her parents are, and makes a point of saying that she has no parents. The male person in her family that oversees her is another character in the story that we'll meet in a minute. But she has no noble breeding, certainly not any that mattered in Persia, and yet she is chosen to become the king. And so that introduces the second plot line in the story, which is her uncle, who is known as Mordecai the Jew. So Mordecai the Jew is a apparently prosperous person within this place, even though he's one of the exiled people from Judah. He is out in the community. He overhears a plot to assassinate the king. And he reports it to Esther. Esther tells the king, saving the king's life. The plotters were caught, they were executed. And then that part of the story kind of goes silent for a few chapters. The third element of the story is a member of the king's inner circle named Haman. Now, if you've read Esther before, you know Haman is the villain in the story. Haman was from a tribe that had a historical hatred for Israel, and so for Judah. And so he decided he was going to demand that all Jews bowed down to him every time he walked out in the streets. Very noticeably, Mordecai the Jew decides not to bow to him, and it makes Haman furious. It triggers Haman to create this plot that becomes the central crisis of the story. Haman told the king that there was a group of people in his kingdom, within his realm, who were different. Literally, that's what it says. They're different. And they did not obey all the laws of the land, including the one that Haman made up for himself, which was that everybody had to bow to him when he walked by. So the king gives Haman his official permission to wipe out all the Jews in the country. So here's the crisis of the story. There is an extermination plot. There is a final solution for the Jews in Persia. And Haman has basically tricked the king into giving his royal seal to this plan. And so that's the central crisis of this story. So the plot, because the orders from the central go out to all the regions of Persia, everyone knows this is coming. So the Jews are weeping and wailing, and the certain bands of kill squads are arming themselves. It's not the army of the country. It's Haman's personal mercenaries are preparing to go out and wipe out all of the Jews. Mordecai hears about it, and he enters into a time of mourning. And for ancient Jews, this meant wearing what they call sackcloth, which is like burlap, wearing burlap clothes and putting ashes on his head. And so it's very public, and word gets to Esther that Mordecai, her uncle Mordecai, is in mourning, and she sends a member of her staff to meet him and find out what the problem was. And then she learns of the plot. Mordecai makes sure to tell her that, remember, you're Jewish too. And that if Haman is going to kill all the Jews in the country, Your head is on the block too. And so this is all a problem, obviously, for Esther. She knows she can't go in and just demand something from the king. She saw what happened to Vashti, right? When Vashti didn't want to just walk in front of a bunch of drunken men. Esther was not going to go in and say, hey, you shouldn't do this. And so she had to do it in the right way. She dresses in her finest clothes and she goes and stands in the court, not near the king, but where he can see her. And the king, ever smitten with Esther's beauty, invites her to come up and speak to her. And he says, I will give, what is it that you want? I will give you anything, even up to half my kingdom. Okay, that's quite the offer. And she evades the question, and instead, in her own sort of gracious way, she offers to host a banquet for the king and for Haman, who is his right-hand man. And so at the banquet, the king says, hey, you can have anything you want up to half my kingdom. And she says, let me throw another banquet for you tomorrow night, for you and for Haman. And then I'll tell you what it is that I want. Well, as Haman left that first dinner, thinking pretty highly of himself, that the queen had thrown a special banquet for him and for the king, he sees Mordecai at the gate again, and everybody bows except for him. And Haman just loses his mind. He has one of his people build a gallows that was 75 feet high, which was meant, obviously, not only to kill Mordecai, but to humiliate him in front of the entire city. Well, that night, the king, now this is in between the first and second banquets. That night, the king is, he can't sleep. And I love this part. He asks for like the recent records, the government records, to be read to him so that he can fall asleep. I just think that's such a funny human detail. It's like, bring me an encyclopedia and read it to me. So they're reading, and they get to the story of where Mordecai the Jew saves the king from being assassinated. And the king says, wait a minute, did we reward him for that? And they say no. And so the next day in the court, Haman comes in feeling pretty good about himself. And the king says, quote, what should be done for a man that the king delights to honor? Haman thought it was for himself. And so, man, does he lay it on. You should give him money and jewels and a special robe. Give him a horse that you have ridden, that the king has ridden. And then they should put him up on the horse and parade him through the city so that all of the city can sing their praises to this person. Of course, he thinks he's talking about himself. Immediately, the king tells Haman, go get Mordecai the Jew and do that for him. And so Haman does everything that he's required. You got to imagine that he's pretty humiliated by this. And then he has to go to the second banquet with the king and with Esther. At the banquet, the king asks Esther what it is she wants from him, and she asks for her people to be spared from this evil plot to exterminate them. The king said, who would do such a thing? And Esther turns on Haman and points at him and says, our adversary and enemy is the vile Haman. The king is so angry that he leaves the room. And when he leaves the room, Haman comes up to Esther on his knees and apparently grabs her legs, pleading for his life. And that's when the king comes in, accuses Haman of assaulting the queen, and has him executed on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. That's not the end of the story. Because, and again, this is one of those things about understanding a story in its own historical context. Apparently, when a king makes an order and puts his seal on it, it cannot be rescinded. So the order to go out and kill all the Jews still stands. Now, the Jews being integrated into the community, but not allowed to arm themselves, the king says, here's what I'll do. I'll issue a second order with my seal that says that the Jews can arm themselves and they can defend themselves against the men who are coming to kill them. And so that's what he did. The Jews were armed. They were allowed to defend themselves. The attackers were wiped out. 500 of Haman's kill squad were wiped out, including his sons, and not a single Jew was killed. The king then elevates Mordecai the Jew to be his second in command. And Mordecai served the king faithfully, but also protected the interests of the Jews in exile for the rest of his life. Isn't that a great story? That is the book of Esther, told in what, 5 minutes or so, 8 minutes. It's a great story. It's not one of the histories. It's one of the writings that was meant to, again, like I talk about short stories. It's a story that's meant to create an understanding that God's people matter, that they are in danger at times, but that God in his providence will protect them, except for one thing. God is not mentioned in the entire book of Esther. And so it's one of those things where people, the imply and infer difference, that historically Jews and then Christians have inferred from this story that God's providence looked out for his people, even in exile and even when they were under threat of death. And so there's some interesting details. The first one I already said, that God isn't mentioned. The second is that it highlights the perils, the dangers of being in exile. You are second-class citizens, even though they were the elites. And so the king brought them to his country because they could benefit him. But they were still second-class citizens. And then one key thing, and this is, every commentator has said this about the book of, one of the reasons this is not considered to be a historical book is that a Persian king could only marry within a narrow list of Persian noble families and would not have married a Jewish woman. But it's nice to think that she was just so pretty and nice that he just wanted to make her his queen. So the second part for us to talk about is, how does this story become part of the Bible? How does a story that doesn't mention God, that isn't really a history, it's not poetry, it's not, there's a lot of things this is not a worship story. How does this end up becoming a part of the canon? Well, first thing to know is that there are two versions of this. There is the 10-chapter version that's in our Bible and in the Hebrew Bible. But there was also in the Greek version of the Old Testament, a 16-chapter version that had all kinds of other details to it. What's important is that this story was an important part of how Jews looked back on their time in exile. The fact that, and as we'll see next week, the fact that Jews survived the exile and got to come home meant that when they got there, they wanted to account for how that had happened. And the story of Esther is how they did that. So it dates back to the 4th century BC, which is after the exile. The written form of this story is a century or so after the exile. And it is the very last book accepted into the Hebrew Bible by what is known as the Great Assembly, which is a gathering of 120 rabbis and Jewish scholars who chose the final Old Testament canon in the 3rd or 4th century. Folks, they're also the group that formed Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. You know how I was saying maybe in the first 10 classes that, remember, all of this is put together just after exile, in response to the exile. This is that moment, fourth century or so BC. This great assembly starts, and they're the ones that assemble from all the sources the final form of the Torah and the writings and the prophets. One theory, and this is actually probably the most plausible theory for why the book of Esther was written and why it became a part of Jewish tradition. Now, work with me here. I said last week that, remember, the northern kingdom gets wiped out. And so it is Judah, which gets taken into exile and allowed to come back. It's Judah that has defined Jewishness since the exile. There is very little contribution into what we understand as Jewishness from the northern kingdom because it got wiped out. It's the southern kingdom that defines Jewishness. And while these people were in exile, they adopted a Babylonian holiday that came to be known as Purim. It was actually P-U-R, which is lot, in the sense of fortune, good fortune, like to cast lots. And so to this day, one of the high holy days in Jewish tradition is Purim, but it was a Babylonian holiday. And once they got back and realized, hey, you know what? None of our Jewish friends who weren't in exile celebrate this holiday. They had to create a story that accounted for the celebration of what had been a Babylonian holiday. And so they tied it to this story about God's providence saving them from the treacherous Haman and accounting for how they survived their time in exile. And so the book of Esther, in addition to being a great story, has a particular function in Jewish culture. It explains the presence of a Babylonian holiday among the high holidays of Jewishness. Isn't that interesting? I think that part is, to me, those little details give this story a little bit more texture for us. But Purim remains one of the main holidays for in the Jewish tradition. And what they're celebrating is their salvation, their protection, and really their ability and the permission that they got to defend themselves from extermination while under exile. But how it functioned for them was it explained why they came back with a new holiday after their time in exile. And so it is part of the Jewish canon. It is part of the Christian canon. There are some theological insights that come from the book of Esther. One of them is what I said before. It is God's providential protection of his people. They were already being punished. God did not want them wiped out. And so that's the narrative, and that's the way we understand it as readers now. It gives us a sense of a theology of God's sovereign providence over his people. But I think as we move, we're in the 21st century now, and lots of us have lived lots of years. We've seen a transition in the way women are treated in our culture. Now, that's not global. I get that it's different in other places, but in this country, it's quite possible that things are better than they were 50, 75 years ago. And that doesn't mean that there are still problems. And, you only have to look back a few years to the whole 2 or 3 years of Me Too, where another area of mistreatment of women was exposed and then shamed in an appropriate way. But I think there's some really modern, what is pre-modern sensibility about women in this story. Vashti, even though in the writing of the story is the villain, she decides she's not going to be paraded like a piece of meat in front of her husband's drunken friends. Now, I would say that the fact that she did that and that it's still in our scriptures represents an advance for us, right? Where she is the inappropriate woman in the time of writing, and we have to understand that that's what it meant then, we can look at it a completely different way now and say Vashti is a pre-model of a woman who isn't going to be abused that way by her husband. And so, and then Esther is such an interesting character because she, on the one hand, enters the story as somebody very demure and very proper and doesn't want to offend anybody, but she has some guile to her. She throws not one, but two banquets to both please her husband and also lull her enemy into a false sense of safety. So Esther is a character who uses her femininity not necessarily in a sexual way, but uses her femininity within the culture where she lives to save her people. Esther is an essential part of the saving of the Jews in exile in this story. And I think that's worth us remembering. So this is like Ruth, this is a sort of a little byway in the narrative of the story of God's people, where we pause and we see this is what it was like, or this is a glimpse of what it was like, or this is saying, yeah, not what it was, but what it was like, if you understand what I mean by the difference. And so for that reason, I think Esther it's a valuable story for us to still read. Unlike some other Old Testament stories, I think this is a story I would give my daughter to read, and with some help for understanding what's going on. But it's a story that I think speaks to the role that, whatever the texts say, the role that women play in everyday life in virtually every society, which is they can talk about men dominating things in pre-modern society, but nobody eats if there aren't women in early societies, right? Nobody eats food if there isn't someone there to prepare it. And in those economies, that was the role that women played. Nobody got born if women didn't birth them. So I think in some ways, Esther is a story that gives us a wider view of women, even in these Bronze Age stories. So with that, I'm going to unmute you, and we're going to see where we go with this.
John, I wonder if Purim is celebrated particularly highly in modern Israel with the theme of we have the right to defend ourselves. And is it?
Yeah, I think the holiday of Purim, I meant to look that up before I got here, but the holiday of Purim is Luann, you want to join in on this with your better interfaith understanding? It's coming up too. It's on Monday.
Huh.
I think it's a really fun holiday.
Yeah. There's lots for the
We've talked
children.
about it a lot, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But I think it's a fun holiday.
It's a festival commemorating the survival of Jews who in the 5th century BC were marked for death by their Persian rulers. Well, that taints the king with the evil behavior of Haman. It wasn't all the Persian rulers that wanted them dead. It was just that one guy. And so let's just see here. So here's the way it's celebrated now. They exchange gifts of food and drink. They will donate charity to the poor. They'll eat a celebratory meal. There will be a public recitation of the scroll of Esther. And they'll recite additions to the daily prayers and grace after meals And then the Hebrew names for all those things are here. But Purim is a happy celebration. They are recreating the celebration when the Jews in Persia realized that they had a voice in government, and B, they had defended themselves against this attempted annihilation.
I remember hearing that it's also a really fun festival for the children. I mean,
I'll
there's
bet.
puppet shows and they get to chase after Haman, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun.
That's right. I forgot that part. There is the chasing of Haman for the kids in the Purim celebration, which is just, good for them. It's and then look, to be serious about this, in light of the actual Holocaust 120 years ago, Purim is a significant holiday, and for some Jews after the events of World War II, for some Jews, they rejected God because God didn't come through again. And so I remember a good friend of mine who was growing up, who was Jewish, whose father said God died in the camps. That was his understanding, that his experiential understanding of God was that God died in the camps. And so for a lot of people, Purim would have been maybe a bitter holiday. I think it's probably renewed in celebration after the establishment of a political Israel now, which, by the way, is not Israel as it is in the Bible. That is a political state. We're going to get, someday we'll spend a little time on that. But so what else? What's interesting to you about Esther? Yeah, Margot, please.
Sorry. I think there's more to Esther than having guile. She had a lot of courage, and her uncle tells her, who knows, but that you've come to this place for this very time for you to do this.
Yeah.
But she could have been put to death.
She could have been. Yeah.
So that was a pretty brave thing for her to do.
Yeah. I don't know that those are mutually exclusive. Brave could have been running in and yelling that it happened, but she was skillful enough to know that it needed to happen a certain way. Mm-hmm. She was a Jew in a Persian royal court. Mm-hmm. And so she had to know every day that, except for the fact that the king fell in love with her, she was a person in exile. Isn't that part interesting? Except for the fact that the king loved her, she was a second-class citizen. Mm-hmm.
What would have happened had she not been beautiful?
Oh, I don't know. And there's no road I can go down on that, Mary. That doesn't sound bad. I don't know. I mean, if she had not been beautiful, he would have married someone else. Mordecai would have been hanged on that 75-foot high gallows, and the Jews would have been defenseless against the kill squads.
So you started that it was historical fiction.
Yes, and by historical fiction, I mean the story, the plot of the story may not be real, but it uses real characters and places.
Right. I find it interesting. A lot of Jews, my understanding is a lot of Jews never returned to Judah. And there was a very successful Jewish community in Babylon, Baghdad, that part of Iraq.
Yes. Yeah, and they have a special name that I can't remember, but there's a special name for the Jews that stayed after the exile.
And the Sassoon family and Kadori family became very prominent in India and China from Baghdad, Jews from Baghdad. So.
And that's a big part of the story of Jewish history all over the place, that the 10 tribes When I say wiped out, I mean their society was wiped out. The northern tribes, they were just spread out over all the world. Some stayed there, but they call that the diaspora, and it happens in fits and starts. People leave for the same reasons that my grandparents emigrated, that they left Italy for economic reasons. There was cholera and earthquakes and political instability, and my grandfather wanted to get a job and support his family, so they left the country. And Jews have left what we would call the Bible lands for all kinds of regular reasons like that, including the two exiles. And I think that's important. It's important then as now. In the time of Jesus and now, probably 90% of Jews did not live in what we would call Israel now. They were spread out over North Africa. They were spread out into Asia Minor. They're spread out even up to what we would call Europe. When we get to Pentecost in a couple of months, that list of all the languages, all the people who hear the gospel in their own language on Pentecost, those are Jews from other parts of the world that speak other languages. And they're parts of these various events in history, these migrations of Jews to other parts of the world.
John,
Yes, please.
is it, if parts of the story of Esther are possibly true, I mean, there was the Jews that went away or were taken away. It seems very likely that Esther might have been a concubine.
It could be. I mean, it's one of these things where this is a tight story with a text that has largely remained unchanged since it was first added to the canon. And so it's I think the more likely explanation for the story of Esther is that it explains Purim. Purim, which had been a Babylonian holiday first.
Mhm.
That gets appropriate. You know how there's always some killjoy at Christmas that says, Jesus wasn't born in December. They just appropriated the winter solstice holiday or whatever. And, they say the same thing about Easter while they're just trying to mimic Passover or some other spring pagan holiday. So what? They still mean what they mean. And Purim means what it means. But it was a festival that was appropriated by the Jews in exile for their own purposes. So it was a celebration that they found. It's like going to another country and finding a holiday you never knew existed. Now, most of us watch Ascension Day come and go. But if you're in Sweden, that's a day off. And not only a day off, but you get the second half of the day before it off to prepare for it. So you go to another country, you experience one of their holidays, and when you come back home, you go, wow, that's a great idea. and so that's a kind of colloquial way of saying that's what's happening in Esther. You're getting an explanation in the scrolls for why this Babylonian holiday becomes a Jewish holiday. I don't even know if it's still celebrated in what would be the descendants of Babylon, which would be Iraqis. I don't know if Iraqis still celebrate this holiday, but Jews sure do. And that's where they got it, even as the same name.
John, in the book of Esther, Mordecai, who he's riding with the king after he gets the second banquet, and he's saved. It says through the book that they take on many families, and Haman had like 10 sons, which were all hung.
Yeah.
And the Jewish armies, or they kill over 75,000, but they don't plunder. They don't
They don't
take-
plunder. That's right.
Don't.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Because they're still exiles. They're still basically in the country against their will. They don't get to take stuff. They just got to defend themselves. That's right. That's an important detail that I left out. In all of the battles of the Jews defending themselves from the murder squads, once they defeat them, they don't plunder them, which would have been a normal. The reason that's mentioned is that that would be like a normal thing that you would do after you beat an army. You would take their stuff. They didn't take their stuff. So yeah, thanks for that, Tim. I forgot about that part. The Bible is a rich and interesting thing to read. And I say that as somebody who, it's sort of a tool of the trade for pastors and teachers. It's something that there's at one level, I have to read it every week. But then at another level, I get reminded every once in a while, and Ruth was like this too, and Esther is certainly like this, that it's an interesting, mind-shaping, life-changing thing to read. When you get a story like this where you go, it's not so much whether it happened or not, it's the fact that it's a story that means something significant to Jewish culture. And for that reason alone, we should read it. Just as a trivia question, anybody know the other book in the Bible that doesn't mention God?
Well, John,
Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon. Yeah, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
well, you bring up another question for me. How many other stories in the Bible are of this kind? I mean, just stories.
Yeah, so remember, one of the things I say at the beginning every week is that we have to pay attention to what kind of literature we're reading, because true means something different when you're talking about a poem or a history, right?
Yeah.
And so Job is probably like this. Job is probably the oldest story in the Bible, older than Genesis in its form. And so Job is probably another story that was told to explain something that people couldn't explain a different way. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's the story of Job. The story of Ruth, I wonder if the story of Ruth is a real story, or if it's meant to be an example story of what it was like to live in a covenantal relationship with each other and with God. And Esther has that function too. It's a snapshot of the dangers that were present for people in exile, and it also explains how they appropriated this Babylonian holiday and made it a Jewish holiday. So it doesn't make them any less valuable, and it even doesn't make them untrue. It makes them true to what they were designed to be. And so, read a poem where it talks about, read one of the Psalms where it talks about God spreading his wings over his people. Now, we know what that means, and it doesn't mean anything about feathers. So we have to read these things for what they are and read them in the form that they are, so that we understand what they mean, what they meant then and what they mean now. Any other questions? So next week, the people of God, the people of Judah, or at least the elites, get to go back to Jerusalem. And on the one hand, that's a happy occasion. And on the other hand, you've got the 20%, 25% that went into exile, and you got the ones that got left and held the fort while they were gone. They're not all happy with each other. So I know that's hard to imagine, communities of faith not all being happy with each other, but here you go. We're in for one of those stories next week. Let me close us in prayer. God, thank you for this story, for the ways that it was, the ways that it is told, and the ways that it has come to mean something so significant for our Jewish brothers and sisters, for the ways that it gives us a reminder that your people at times have been under threat of killing and annihilation, but also that sometimes a story is there to give an explanation for why we're having a party. And so, God, thank you for that, and thank you for how that informs us about the people who came before us, who follow you, and maybe some things about how we can do that better ourselves. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Ezra and Nehemiah next week.
Okay.